Every character in Invincible carries something heavy. The show doesn't really let anyone off the hook, but some backstories hit different from the rest, and when you sit down and compare them, the answer to who has it worse is not the one most people expect. Today we're going through the strongest candidates for safest backstory, and by the end, I think you'll see why this question is harder to answer than it seems. The easy answer, the one most people reach for, is Mark. He found out his dad was a villain, got beaten half to death by him, watched the people around him keep dying in fights he couldn't stop, and carried PTSD so severe it manifested as full-on hallucinations during his homecoming in season 4. All of that is true and very, very sad. But Mark had something most of the people on this list didn't. He had a real childhood. He had a mother who loved him unconditionally, a best friend in William, a normal teenage life before the power showed up. When things got dark, he had a foundation to fall back on. What makes the characters we're going to look at today different is that most of them never had that. The damage started earlier, and there wasn't anyone as solid as Debbie around to help them hold it together. Before the costume, before the powers, before they had any say in it at all, their trauma was already forming, starting with the one people always bring up first. Rexplode gets written off as the arrogant guy who cheated on Eve and spent most of season 1 being insufferable, and yeah, he was. But the reason he was like that makes a lot more sense once you know where he came from. Rex grew up in a poor family, not struggling, actually destitute. And when he was still a child, his father actually sold him. That's the starting point. A government organization showed up with a suitcase of money. His father said yes without hesitation, and Rex left with strangers before he was old enough to understand what was happening. They trained him. They ran surgeries on him to give him his powers. Then they pointed him at targets and sent him out to steal, commit arson, and assassinate people. He wasn't a hero. He was a child soldier being used as a weapon by people who bought him from the family that was supposed to protect him. Eventually, he ran. After meeting Eve while on his way to blow up the Pentagon, something shifted and he got out. He found the teen team. He built something resembling a normal life. And then he went looking for his family, the people he'd been taken from, the people he'd spent years telling himself he'd go back to. They'd moved on. New house, new kids, new life, no space for him in any of it. So the version of Rex we see in the show, the bravado, the deflection, the way he fills every silence with a joke, is a person who was taught very early that he was disposable. A family that sold him and had 2 more children and moved on. That kind of pain doesn't fade away easily. When he finds out they replaced him, the show barely pauses on it. It passes as a piece of backstory. But think about what it takes to hear that and keep going. To show up, put on a costume, do the job, be the guy who makes everyone laugh, while carrying the knowledge that the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally looked at you and decided you were worth less than the money in a government suitcase. By the time he dies in season 3, he's finally becoming someone worth knowing. Near death after the Lizard League fight, he stopped, thought about the damage he'd done, started showing up differently for the people around him. He backed Mark and Eve getting together without any jealousy or resentment, which, knowing his history with Eve and the advancement issues he must have had, is not a small thing. He helped Shrinking Ray move out of the GDA. He was, for the first time, building real relationships instead of merely performing one. And then the Invincible War happened, and evil alternate Mark tore him apart. And Rex, mortally wounded and with almost nothing left, used the one power he had that nobody else could replicate. He charged his own skeleton and detonated it, taking the variant with him. All that remained after was a scorched mark on a wall. Shrinking Ray had just retired from being a hero. She watched him go in alone from a distance and couldn't do anything. She carried that with her while the show moved on to the next crisis, the way the show always moves on because there's always another crisis. The tragedy of Rexplode isn't just that he died young. The saddest part is that he died right at the moment he'd started to figure out who he was and who he wanted to be. The boy nobody kept finally had people worth staying for, and he couldn't stay. And he used his last act to make sure they got to Monster Girl's situation hits differently, because the cruelty of it is almost absurd in how unfair it is. Amanda was a student sharp enough to graduate 2 years ahead of her class. She went on a school trip to Europe, fell for a Romanian boy, and his grandmother caught them together. The grandmother was a practitioner of magic, and she cursed Amanda for it, not the boy. Amanda. Every time Amanda transforms into her monster form and comes back to human, she physically de-ages. Her cells rebuild incorrectly, setting her back. She was 29 years old when the show finds her, and she looks 12. She has the experiences, memories, and emotional maturity of a grown woman living in the body of a child because she kissed the wrong person's grandson on a school trip. Think about what that means for daily life. You can't be taken seriously. You can't walk into a room and have people see what you are. Every time you use the power that defines you, you lose a piece of yourself. Physically, irreversibly. And the only reason any of it happened is because someone's grandmother decided that your relationship was an insult. There's no grand villain, no government experiment, no tragic family legacy, just a woman who fell in love at the wrong moment and has been paying for it ever since. What the show mostly skips over is the daily texture of that. She can't go to a bar, she can't walk into a professional setting. Rex made fun of her age the first time they met because from the outside, that's all he could see. She beat him up for it, which is fair, but the underlying problem didn't go anywhere. She chose to keep using her powers anyway. That's what sets her apart. She knew what each transformation was costing her. The physical regression, the way she was slowly disappearing into a younger and younger body, and she kept going because people needed help. That's true nobility. Someone deciding that doing the right thing matters more than what it takes from her personally, over and over, for years, while watching herself get smaller in the mirror every time. Rudy eventually builds her a belt that stops the de-aging, and by the time they spend what amounts to hundreds of years in the Flaxen dimension together, the problem is managed. But she spent years looking like a child while carrying the full weight of an adult life, and the show mostly uses that as background texture rather than spending time on what it costs her. That's part of what makes it sad. The show almost lets you forget how awful her situation is. Now, for the one the show spent an entire special episode on, Adam Eve's backstory is different from everyone else's on this list because the wrongness of it starts before she was born. A government scientist named Dr. Elias Brandyworth found a homeless pregnant woman named Polly and paid her to undergo experiments designed to flood her amniotic fluid with rapidly decaying particles. Eve was built, not born. She was engineered as a weapon before she ever had a heartbeat. The mental block that limits her from using her powers on living matter wasn't a natural feature of her biology. It was put there deliberately, a kill switch installed in a fetus, so the asset would have limitations the handlers could work around. Her biological mother, Polly, died giving birth to her. The family that raised her, the parents we see in the show, weren't abusive in the way the comics make explicit, but they were cold in a way that reads as a different kind of damage. Her father in particular treated her powers as an embarrassment, something to manage rather than something to understand. Eve grew up knowing she was different without understanding why in a house where being different was clearly a problem, with a mother who died the day she came into the world and a creator who never told her the truth about what she was. The Adam Eve special gives us the scene that makes the whole thing land. 12-year-old Eve standing in front of the men responsible for what was done to her and her mother, with full access to a power that could unmake them at the molecular level. She can see every atom, she knows exactly what she could do, and she chooses not to destroy them. She erases their memory of her instead. She doesn't get revenge, she doesn't get closure, she removes herself from the story of the people who made her and walks away, which is both the most powerful thing she could do and the quietest version of it. That choice tells you everything about who Eve is. She had godlike power in that moment, and she used it to disappear. The show in later seasons shows us what happens when that restraint finally breaks down. The conquest fight in season 3, where she's bleeding out and removes the mental block completely, is the payoff of a lifetime of holding back. Every terrible thing she survived that evening is the direct result of what was done to her before she was born. Eve was a weapon built by people who never asked her consent. She spent her entire life deciding not to be what they made her. That's not a backstory. That's a war she's been fighting alone since childhood. The mental block is the detail that keeps coming back. It wasn't installed because of a flaw in the experiment. It was installed on purpose. The people who built her decided that she was too powerful to exist without limitations, so they put a governor on her before she was born and handed her to a family without telling either of them what she was. She grew up thinking she had chosen her own restraint, that the block was part of her rather than something placed in her, and the moment moment she finds out the truth, it reframes everything. The discipline she thought was hers, the control she thought she'd developed. All of it built on top of something that was never supposed to be hers to choose. And then there's the relationship with Polly, which the special handles quietly but painfully. Eve's biological mother died giving birth to her. She never got to know her. She grew up with people who were paid effectively to raise a government asset in a household where her powers were an inconvenience and her origins were a secret. The first person who ever had unconditional biological stakes in her existence died on the day she arrived. Every relationship Eve builds in the show, with Mark, with the teen team, with the people she chooses to help, she builds from scratch, from nothing, with no template for what being truly loved looks like, because the one person who would have given her that didn't make it through the door. And now, for the two that people don't put in this conversation nearly enough, Nolan Grayson's story is complicated in a way none of the others are, because the suffering he carries is inseparable from the suffering he caused. He was born into a culture that killed most of its own population to make the survivors stronger. They survived the Scourge virus that wiped out most of what was left. Spent thousands of years as a soldier, conquering planets, following orders, doing what the Viltrumite Empire asked him to do without ever being given space to consider whether any of it was right. He came to Earth with a mission. He fell in love with a human woman even though he wasn't supposed to love. He had a son, and he spent 20 years trying to keep those two things in separate boxes, the mission in one, the family in the other, because letting them touch each other was dangerous. The season 1 finale is the moment those boxes collapse. He nearly kills his own son. He leaves the planet, and what the show tracks across the next 3 seasons is a man trying to understand who he is when he's not following orders, when he's not the Empire soldier, when the only thing left is the family he almost destroyed, and the question of whether any of it can be repaired. What makes Nolan's backstory painful beyond the violence he committed is the loneliness underneath all of it. He's been alive for over 2,000 years. He's outlived everyone he was trained with. Every planet he spent time on is either gone or colonized. The people who knew him when he was young are dead. He arrived on Earth, and for the first time in centuries, he made something that felt like a home, and the mission required him to eventually destroy it. He couldn't. That failure, which saved Earth, cost him the only thing he'd built in 2,000 years that mattered to him. Then there's Oliver, Mark's half-brother, born on Thraxa to a mother whose species aged so fast she was elderly by the time Oliver was a toddler. He grew up at an accelerated rate, skipping the childhood that Mark had, arriving at physical adulthood before he'd had time to develop the emotional foundation that's supposed to come first. His mother died when he was young by any reasonable measure. His father was absent for the first years of his life fighting a war. He was brought to Earth and handed to a woman, Debbie, who had never asked for another child and was already processing the fact that her husband had tried to kill her son. Oliver spent his early life stuck between two worlds, not fully Thraxan, not fully Viltrumite, not human in the way the people around him were human. He aged into his powers faster than his judgment could catch up with them. He made choices that cost people their lives because he had a 17-year-old's power in a 10-year-old's emotional framework. And the show doesn't really slow down to let him process any of it, because there's always another war, always another crisis, always somewhere else he needs to be. There's something uniquely painful about watching a character who never had the chance to be a child in any real sense. Mark had a childhood. He had school, friends, ordinary problems, the kind of mundane texture that builds the foundation you pull from when things get hard. Oliver had a mother who aged visibly faster than most humans age in a year, a father who wasn't there, and a power set that arrived before he had the emotional vocabulary to use it responsibly. He grew up the way a weed grows, fast and in whatever direction had the most light, without anyone cultivating the shape of it. The fact that the show handles him with some lightness in his earlier appearances, the jokes about him being a kid who kills too casually, doesn't cancel out how dark that is when you sit with it. A child who kills casually isn't funny. He's a child who was never shown another option. In the comics, Oliver eventually becomes a spy for Thrag, manipulated by someone stronger into betraying the brother who raised him. He realizes his mistake and tries to turn it back, and it costs him everything. He dies protecting Tara, Mark, and Eve's daughter. His final act is giving his his life for the next generation of a family he never fully felt like he belonged to. One more character who never gets included in this conversation and should. Debbie Grayson isn't a superhero. She doesn't have a tragic origin. She's a woman who met a man she loved, married him, built a life with him across 20 years, raised a son she loved more than anything, and then found out that none of it was what she thought it was. The thing about Debbie's situation that the show handles better than most comparable stories is that it doesn't treat her pain as secondary to the superhero plot. Her husband wasn't hiding an affair or a gambling debt or a secret second family. He was hiding the fact that he was an alien soldier whose mission was to eventually help conquer the planet she lived on. The entire architecture of her adult life, the man she loved, the home they built, the years she thought she understood, was built on a foundation that didn't exist, and she still loves him. That's the part that gets her. She tells Mark in season 2 that the worst part isn't that Nolan lied. The worst part is that she can't stop loving him even knowing what he is and what he did. That's not weakness, that's the specific cruelty of 20 years of real feeling existing inside a false premise. The love was real. It was just also part of a cover story. Those two things are both true, and there's no clean way to hold them. She doesn't get powers to process it with. She doesn't get a training montage or a revenge arc. She gets a house she can't sell because of the memories in it, a son who's now flying into space to fight wars she can't participate in, and a bottle of wine she's drinking alone in the kitchen when the episode finds her. Sandra expertly plays all of it with the specific exhaustion of someone who's been holding themselves together for too long and has run out of energy to pretend otherwise. By season 4, Debbie's moved forward in the ways she can. She had a relationship with Paul that didn't work out. She's been raising Oliver during the gaps between Mark's absences. She announced she's going to Telescria to be with Oliver. She's integrating herself into the world she's been standing outside of for 3 seasons, but the show is careful not to frame any of that as healing in the clean sense. She's adapting. She's choosing. The wound is still there. Her past wasn't designed to break her, so Debbie doesn't have the saddest backstory per se, but what happens to her in the show's present tense is the most quietly devastating thing happening to any non-powered character in the story. She trusted her life choices and her husband completely. She had every reason to, and she's been paying for that trust since the moment Nolan flew away. So who has it the worst? Rex comes closest to a clean answer if you're measuring purely by circumstances. Sold by his father, became no one, formative years spent being used as a weapon, dead at the exact moment he'd figured out who he wanted to be. The cruelty of the timing alone is almost unbearable. Monster Girl's situation is unfair in a way that almost defies articulation. She didn't do anything. There was no grand mistake, no wrong choice she could have made differently. She went on a school trip and fell in love. The punishment for that was a lifetime of watching herself shrink. Nolan's is the most complicated because the suffering he carries is bound up with suffering he caused. You can't fully separate the two. He's a man who spent 2,000 years becoming exactly what his culture needed him to be, then spent the last 4 seasons of the show trying to undo that at the speed of human forgiveness, which is slower than Viltrumite biology and not guaranteed to arrive at all. Oliver never got a real childhood. That matters more than the show gives it credit for, but Eve's situation is the one that stays with you longest because the violation of it is so complete. She didn't have a bad childhood that shaped her wrong. She was engineered before birth to be something other than a full person and then handed to strangers and left to figure it out. The mental block, the dead mother, the cold house, the years of restraint built on a foundation she never got to choose. Everything she's built against that, the relationships, the values, the choices she makes when the power is in her hands. And she could do anything with it. She built from nothing against the design, not because of it. The show is full of people who were broken by things that happened to them. Eve is the one who was broken intentionally, and she's still here, still choosing to be a good person every single day. If this show does one thing consistently, it refuses to let its characters' lives be simple. Season 5 hits in early 2027. Subscribe so you're here when it does.